Okay, it is noon. Hello and welcome to Monona Terrace's Web Wellness Talks. My name is Misty Lorenz and I am the Community Events Coordinator at Monona Terrace. Today we welcome Dr. Beth Olson, an Associate Professor in the College of Agricultural and Life Sciences, Nutritional Sciences Department, and the Nutrition Specialist with the UW Extension, who is here through Badger Talks, the Speakers Bureau of the UW Madison campus. For more information on this great free resource for the state, please visit badgertalks.wisc.edu. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. At the end of this session, we will offer Q&A for you to ask questions. You can do this by clicking the Q&A icon on your screen and typing in the text box that appears. Please feel free to type in your questions during the presentation. Following this presentation, a copy of this webinar and list of links will be posted on the Wellness Talks page of the Monona Terrace website. Link is posted in the chat. Now I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Beth Olson, who will be presenting on Getting Older, Should We Care More About Our Nutrition? Dr. Olson received her undergraduate degree from UW Madison in biochemistry and her MS and PhD in nutrition from the University of California, Davis. Dr. Olson started her career at the Kellogg Company, working in global research and development and as Director of Nutrition for Kellogg USA, before moving back into academia. For the last 25 years, she has focused her research, teaching, and outreach on nutrition education for older adults and nutrition education for families feeding infants, including breastfeeding support for low-income and working women. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Beth Olson.
Well, thank you for having me here today. Does it sound okay, Misty?
Yes, sounds good to me.
Okay. So as you can see in the talk, I think I have nutrition and health as we age, but also about have life in your years, not just years in our lives. And that's really because we don't want to just get older. We want to be healthy as we get older. We want to be some of the healthy older adults. So this next slide, I just wanted to share so that we know why, we have so many older adults. We're just living longer than we did in the beginning of the 20th century. You can see in the beginning up to maybe 1930 or 40, how the line goes up and down. And the people who do this kind of work says life expectancy was volatile, up and down. This had to do with things like epidemics, flu epidemics, wars, things that really impacted how long people lived because people would die younger from these various causes. But you can see starting in the 40s and 50s, it's evening out. I think this is largely due to vaccines, to healthcare, to medicine. Things that we used to die of, decades ago, we can survive and live longer. But that means we're also susceptible to more chronic diseases, and that's more what I'm going to talk about today. Um, just for your own interest, if you can see there at the end, the little dips down. If I were doing this live, I'd ask people to guess, but that is from COVID. We really had a lot of our older adults dying during the time when COVID was really epidemic in the country, and but we are ticking back up again now. I did want to just point out that life expectancy in the US, this data is a little older, but it hasn't changed. I kept this one because it had a nice graph. Um, isn't the same across our gender, our two sexes, that is, or race and ethnic groups. So you can see some groups have longer life expectancies than others. I'm not going to talk a lot about that today. It's complex, more than just nutrition and physical activity, many reasons. But I just wanted to make you aware that, we do have some what we would call health disparities in the United States. So I did want to ask you all what successful aging might look like to you. How would you define that? And we're going to run a little poll for you to rank what you think are the things that lead to successful aging. So we're having you rank it 1, 2, 3. This is just your opinion, no right and wrong. So Misty, I shut the thing, so I don't know if I'll see when the answers come up. So let me know when it's done.
Sure, no problem. It looks like people are just look like they're done.
Okay. So we can see here what people are thinking are most important. And I think a lot of that reflects to, the kind of things that we value when it comes to our health. And so there are no right and wrong, there's no ranking actually. But successful aging does have these categories you just looked at out of, and I wanted to bring it up because there is research on successful aging. And so what do researchers define as aging successfully as opposed to normally, which would not have these things? So things like diseases and disability, but also how we think, our mental health, and also how we're engaged in society, whether we're independent versus, say, dependent on others in some kind of facility. And then the last one is resilience. And I just wanted to give an example of that because it's not always obvious to people what resilience means. I heard someone interview a man under this topic years ago, and it was from a study of people who had lived to be over 100. So he was a swimmer, and he had gone blind in his older age. So he put padding in his swim cap and he swam till he got to the end of the lane and he hit his head. And then he turned around and he swam back. And when they interviewed him, he said, "Yeah, it's not a big deal. When I hit the end, I'm not really going that fast." So we call that resilience, meaning he could have stopped swimming. He could have let his blindness stop him from doing the exercise that he liked, but he didn't. He adapted and he kept going. And that's what can happen, is more likely to happen when people successfully age. They have barriers, but they overcome them or bounce back. So our second poll for today is really looking at what do you think helps someone age successfully? So what are the kind of factors that happen in our lives that cause us to become one of those people who doesn't have chronic disease, perhaps, or doesn't have disability? So we can go ahead and start that poll. Again, no right or wrong answers, just which do you think are ones that are, you know, most important, say. Okay, so as you all can probably see, we really, there's a pretty good split among what things we think help people to age successfully, if you will. So today, these are a listing of what you could pick from, and these are the things that have been found in research. And as I mentioned earlier, talking to or hearing someone interviewed who was over 100, now that people are living long enough, we can really study what are these kind of factors that lead to longer life. Earlier, in research in earlier times, people might die of, for instance, flu or other diseases like that, and so we didn't really know as well, what helped people to get to older age. Today, I'm going to talk in my area, which is diet and physical activity. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the rest of these, but I did think it was important for you all to see them. And I did highlight a couple in red, which I thought were important or interesting. I just happened to see a talk on stress management. And so it's important that we can respond to a stressful situation. But if we're chronically stressed throughout our lives, and this is what the speaker was talking about, it can cause hormone changes and other things that can contribute to a shorter life. Then there's, of course, being able to sleep enough, not smoking, being careful with our alcohol. But also, I think important is our social life or engagement with the world around us. So people that live longer are involved in activities, have family and friends that support them. I did then want to highlight too at the end the genetics, our environment, and their interaction. We can do many things to help improve the health in our lives, but we do have our genes, and we can't always change. Usually, can't change that. So we can do everything right and still have something happen, and that's not on us. That's just something that happens. And also, we can't always change the environment we're in. Somebody can't perhaps change the fact that they grew up in a place where the environment was more polluted or they had exposure to some kind of chemical in their environment. So there are things though that we can do something about, and that's what we want to focus on. So this slide is taken from the US Dietary Guidelines from 2020 to 2025. As you've probably heard, new ones are due out. We're not quite sure what they're going to say, but the process does involve a scientific report, which then is taken by the government and translated into guidelines that people in the healthcare industry and nutrition education use for all populations. This slide is about older adults. So it's looking at adults 60 and over and showing the guidelines talk a lot about whole foods, less processed foods. So whole foods would be things like vegetables and fruits, grains, dairy, protein foods. So the light blue bars are showing recommendations of servings per day. And then the purple shows where people 60 and above are right now. And as you can see, we fall a bit below a lot of the recommendations, particularly women, probably in part because we have fewer calories that we take in on average. But I also want to point out that as far below as we fall in a couple of these categories, we fall even further below in some subcategories, including in vegetables, the dark red, the leafy greens. We don't eat enough of those. In grains, we tend to eat more refined grains and not enough whole grains. And then in the protein foods, we tend to eat enough from the animal groups. This is, of course, for everybody on average. And where we tend to fall short is protein from things like seafood and from plant proteins. So even within these categories, we want people to eat a variety. So the widest variety that you can select among vegetables, fruits, grains, will improve your nutrition and your health. Now, we take those dietary guidelines and we developed something, not me personally, but nutritionists, something called the Healthy Eating Index. It's a measure of how close to the dietary guidelines people eat. Older adults actually have the highest score of any population group. We seem to have, wised up and decided we got to do something about our health and eat better. The next highest group tends to be our littlest children, where parents are very concerned and have more control over what they eat. But as you can see, the scale goes from 0 to 100. Even for older adults, one of the best groups, we're at a 63. So we've got a lot of room for improvement. But I did also want to talk about dietary patterns. We don't eat a fruit or, a piece of pizza or some rice. We eat a meal and we eat those in patterns. So that if you Google the dietary guidelines, you can get Their patterns, it should say patterns, I see, I covered it up with a picture. Um, and in the back of the dietary guidelines, they've taken what people typically eat in the US and kind of tweaked it to be healthy, and they'll show that as a pattern of how many of all the food groups you need each day, as well as a vegetarian. Vegetarians have to pay extra attention to a few things, but can have a very healthy diet. But the two other groups I wanted to show you today in the next couple slides are the healthy Mediterranean and the healthy dash eating plan. So if you've paid attention to nutrition news, you've probably seen something on the Mediterranean diet. It's quite popular. There are many versions of it. This is one. There isn't one Mediterranean country. So they eat, differently across those countries. But this is one compiled version. And I think what's important to note is what's probably most different from how many of us eat in the United States. The bottom of, so what we should eat a lot of if we're trying to adhere to the Mediterranean diet, is animal or plant products. So fruits, vegetables, grains, meat, nuts, legumes. And as you can see, as you move up the pyramid, the animal products come into play. The next line up is the seafood, which I mentioned we don't in the US tend to eat as much of as we should. And then there's much more moderation for the animal products with meats and then sweets, foods high in added sugars, at the very tip. But if I add on or talk about the DASH eating plan, you'll see there's some similarities. Now, the DASH was a diet developed for people with hypertension. And what was so striking about it was people who adhered to this diet actually had blood pressure lowering along the same lines as people who took medication. So it was an example that for some people, not for everyone, one can lower disease risk through diet. And this similarly, you'll see they call for limiting fat, full fat dairy and meat. So animal products that are higher in fat versus those that are leaner. Again, the sugar sweetened foods and beverages. And then because it was blood pressure, restricting sodium intake or keeping that lower. I think we all are aware that sodium is related to blood pressure, but what about the sweets? This has always been a hard topic to kind of get our heads around, but it may not just be what's in the sweets. It may be that when people have a diet high in sweets, sugar sweetened beverages, it's pushing other foods out of their diet. So we want to have, for instance, fruit for dessert maybe instead of cake, that kind of thing. It's not saying never, it's just saying limit. And the reason that we talk about dietary patterns or how foods go together is we have some pretty good evidence that that has good health outcomes. We have done large studies looking at single nutrients and at single foods. And in general, we haven't been able to show benefit. And we think that's because there isn't just a benefit of nutrients, it's the combination of nutrients and foods and the combinations of foods across some of these healthy eating plans. So on the left is that healthy eating index. So eating like the dietary guidelines, the Mediterranean and the DASH diet. And what we find is if people follow those, this was a study where they followed people for 15 years, those who had the best patterns, so the highest healthy eating index as opposed to the lowest, had a lower risk of death, cardiovascular deaths, and cancer deaths. And this was similar if we looked at how people ate across the Mediterranean diet or the DASH diet. So it actually showed over 15 years, people adhering to these kind of diets were better off in health outcomes on average than people who did not. Now, I am just going to add this in because I started my career at Davis in graduate school looking at dietary fiber. My whole lab was involved with how fiber affects health back when we didn't really understand what it did. And so that's what we were exploring. But I just wanted to note that if one adheres to those diets where you're being a little more careful not to have so many animal foods and you're having more plant foods, those foods are going to be higher in fiber. And so I just wanted to show here how far we actually are now from the recommended amounts of, in the 30s and in the 20s for women of grams of fiber. And you can see, men are near 18 as they get older and women around 14 grams. So that's largely a reflection of eating a little bit more processed foods versus whole foods, which might have more fiber. And so I think that's one thing you could look at is how much fiber is in my diet, and it would give you a marker of how well your diet is doing. So why do we even care? I'm going to go now through just a couple of diseases and some nutrients that I feel like we could pay attention to that might help us improve our diet. So we really want to keep what we have. So we'd like to be this woman on the left and not the one on the bottom right who has lost a lot of her muscle mass. We want to retain that muscle mass throughout our life. If we don't, it's called sarcopenia. So that's when we lose muscle. It's something that a doctor can check with function tests. They do things like grip strength and how fast you can stand up and sit. But as you can see, the incidence of having low muscle mass increases as we get older. And what I thought was very striking when I found this data was between the ages of 40 and 80, we can lose up to 50% of our muscle mass. So, that's scary to me, and a reason that not the only reason, but one of the reasons that I keep exercising. Similarly, we want to hold on to our bones. So we want to have a normal bone mass as opposed to a low bone mass. Low bone mass is called osteopenia, but even a higher loss is called osteoporosis. So on the left, we have what our bone would look like if it were normal, and on the right shows bone that is osteoporotic. So you can see how we might have trouble if we had both low muscle mass and then we have low bone mass, and for instance, we might trip and fall, how easily then the bones might break. And so a lot of people think about low bone mass as something that happens when we're older, but it's really an accumulation. We want to build bone throughout our childhood, our young adulthood, so that when we stop building bone, which happens around 30, we have the highest bone mass we could. And then we want to maintain that. So we can begin to lose bone mass even in our we can start losing bone mass in our 20s, but we can lose it in our 30s too if we don't have a good diet and exercise that I'm going to talk about next. But just to give you an idea of the magnitude of in our population, this is osteoporosis 65 and older for women and men. And so you can see for men, it's not that high. For women, it's about 30%, little under. But if we look at low bone mass, this is what I find quite striking. For men, it's about 40%, and women, it's 53% at 65 and older have low bone mass. So you can see this is something that does happen if men live long enough, does happen to most women at this point if they live long enough. So what can we do well, first I'm going to talk about why do we even care about bone mass and muscle mass. So a big reason is falls. So in 2020, about a third of adults, not quite, 28% of adults, 65 and years and older reported that they fell at least once, if not more in a year. When a bone fracture happens, for instance, a hip fracture, it can actually prove fatal within the first year of life. I think the first time I heard that, I was just appalled, surprised. And we have over 38,000 deaths from falls each year in older adults. I mean, that's really, to me, striking. So that is something we can reduce the risk for with nutrition and physical activity, and that's what I'm going to talk about next. But I did want to note that there's also environmental changes, and this is something that if you go to different websites for older adults, the Osteoporosis Foundation, for instance, you can find out more about. But things like having better lighting in our houses, being careful with throw rugs, having hand supports. So we don't want to fall. If we do fall, we want to be in the best spot to weather that fall. So how do we do that? We can do it with nutrition and physical activity. So in physical activity, we classify physical activity as both aerobic, so strengthening our heart. This would be, what's especially important for us related to reducing chronic disease risk, but also muscle strengthening. We want to keep our muscles strong so that we can support ourselves and grip, and if we fall, we can catch ourselves. And also balance. I think that's something often overlooked. UW Extension heads a program called Strong Bodies. That's included in the resources that are going to be provided to you. And they also train people around the state to provide this program. They work on strength training. They talk about aerobic physical activity, but they work, and you can take these classes in person or online, but they also work on strength training, and they also work on balance. So we need all of these things to keep ourselves from falling. And so then I'm going to finally, I think, kind of get to nutrition and talk a little bit about the things that we can do nutritionally to make sure that we are in the best shape we can be. So protein's always a hot topic. I think it's been hot since I started in this field. It comes and goes in what we're talking about it, but we do need it's recommended about just under a gram of protein for every kilogram we weigh each day. But there's many people that have proposed that older adults might need a little bit more. And it's safe for us to have between 10 and 35% of our calories as protein. And most of us around 15 or 16%. So, we're okay, we're getting enough protein, but if we had a little more, it wouldn't necessarily be problematic. However, it isn't just having protein, it's the kind of protein, it's when we have it, how our meals look. So in the old days, we would call it a complete protein. We don't say that as much anymore, but it would be protein that looks more like our body because it then provides the amino acids, the building blocks of protein that we need. So it's going to be animal products like meat, seafood, dairy, eggs, but also plants. Soy is a good plants. Soy is a good source of protein, and in combinations, things like beans and rice or beans and flour in a tortilla, those together can provide us with enough of the amino acids that we need to build up our bones. So we want to have that wide variety. But there is some evidence recently that as we get older, we maybe aren't as good at getting that protein into our muscles. And we would do better if we had more high quality protein at each meal. So when you think about it, if you are eating something like toast and jam for breakfast and coffee, you're probably not having any protein. And so that might be a reason to add something like yogurt, or if you're at lunch, you're having a salad, it might be a reason to add some chicken so that you get protein in each meal. It's suggested it might be 25 to 30 grams. We're still working on that, but just to give you an idea of what 30 grams could look like in a breakfast, it's just yogurt with almonds. So not, a terribly lot of food or a funny combination. This is something students helped me put together. So we borrowed, because we could get nice pictures from my fitness pal, a turkey taco bowl with cauliflower rice. So a little bit different, not something everybody eats every day, but it does give a wide variety of kinds of proteins in the vegetables, in the meat, where someone might be able to get closer to 30 grams a day. And so if I talk about individual nutrients, so that would come with your diets, calcium and vitamin D are one. As you know, we need calcium for strong bones. We need it to function for many things in our body. And so when we have enough, we store it in our bones. So I call that a functional storage reserve. It's kind of storing calcium for when we need it for things like making our nerves work. We need calcium. So if we don't eat enough, we're going to take it out of our bones, and that's how we're going to develop osteopenia or osteoporosis. So the table is just showing you that most men and women don't get enough calcium or vitamin D from their food. If they take supplements, they're a little better off. But for vitamin D, we can also get it from the sun. So that's one where it's hard to tell if someone just from their diet, if they have enough D, because they might be getting some of it from sunshine. It is one I would say is important if you think you're not getting enough and you do want to use supplements, to talk to your healthcare provider, because there are interactions among nutrients and other things that we want to be careful with if we're going to use supplements. But other nutrients we might want to think about are water as we get older, not necessarily related to muscle and bone, which protein and calcium and D are all important for, but water, especially as we get much older, we tend to not drink enough fluids and have some chronic low-level hydration, which can lead to things like falls. So we no longer say 8 glasses a day because it varies by person. And you really should drink whenever you're thirsty. However, as we get older, sometimes we lose a little bit of that thirst mechanism. And so you might just want to be thinking more about it as you get older than you did when you were younger. And the best measure of how hydrated you are is actually the color of your urine. It should be very pale. If it's very dark, then you're dehydrated. So pretty simple measure, actually. And you can get it from different beverages, foods, something like watermelon fruits have a lot of water in it too. But if you think you are not getting enough, consider adding some water because, it's generally free, and just a good way to hydrate. Alcohol is dehydrating, so that does not count in our fluid intake. Um, and then the last individual nutrient I think I'm going to talk about today is B12. This is something vegetarians tend to know more about because there isn't as much in there isn't B12 in plant foods, it's in animal foods. So if you're vegetarian, you need to use other sources. But also as we age, we have less stomach acid and we can have trouble getting the vitamin D out of food. And so fortified foods where the vitamin D is not bound up and supplements can provide alternatives. Again, I would talk to your healthcare provider before you would look at adding any vitamin or any supplements to your diet. So how do we know if these things are in our food? Well, I would tell you if you can look up online sources of nutrients from whole foods, but if you're using packaged foods, they will have a label, a fat nutrition facts panel with how much of the nutrients they have, as well as an ingredient label. I would say I tell everybody, use these exclusively. Don't look at the rest of the packaging. I worked in the food industry. There's a lot of other regulations around what else can be said on foods, and it's really hard to distinguish on a packaging what's the most accurate. But these are very regulated, the nutrition facts and the ingredients. So here you can check for saturated fat, keeping that lower. That would be the diets that recommend, limiting animal fats. The sodium we talked about with the DASH diet. Again, you can check for fiber. Fiber is really in plant foods, but you can also get it in a lot of cereals and grains that you can buy. So going for the whole wheat spaghetti and the whole grain cereals will help you get more fiber, which is excellent for us. And then watching sugars. Again, not because the sugars necessarily do anything, but they're going to crowd out other nutrients, along with protein. And then as you can see, vitamin D, calcium on the bottom are also required to be in the label. And they may label other ingredients or other nutrients, particularly if they fortify with them. Something like orange juice will likely put on the vitamin C because it has a lot of vitamin C. But nutrition isn't really just about when we get old. It's something that we should be concerned about all along. So waiting until the problem happens is a lot harder to address than if we can address it as we're going along. Like me, many of you probably can't do anything about the early years. But we have family, we have partners, spouses, we may be taking care of an older adult, but also have children, grandchildren. So we can role model for them to help with nutrition through the lifespan, even if it's a period of time we've already passed. There's a lot of concern now about nutrition programs because of things happening with the government. We can volunteer. There's Meals on Wheels. I worked for that for a little while. Wonderful program delivering meals to family, older adults who are shut in, who can't get out, donations to food banks. So there's a lot of ways personally we can help with nutrition. We can also look at policies and advocacy. When I work at the university, I do research, but outside of that, I can provide that data for supportive nutrition programs, opportunities for activity. Outside of that, I can do my own advocacy outside of my work. But there's these programs like Meals on Wheels, like SNAP, like opportunities for activity. We've had Rails to Trails. There are many places where you can donate time or energy or advocacy to say, let's make our environment, our nutrition environment, our nutrition programs, our opportunities for activity better for everyone. So the last couple of topics I wanted to mention are, again, kind of looking at the world around us. And some of our health experiences probably have to do with ageism. So 82% of older adults have said they have felt the effects of ageism. They've seen messages, interactions, or they themselves just inside feel that they're older and something is wrong with that. It's ageism is a discrimination. It can be for younger adults too. You know, we've probably all said, oh, they're young, they don't know anything. That's a type of ageism. It negatively impacts our health as we age if we experience that. And so I've recently attended a workshop that Extension did on this, and they talked about what can we do as we age ourselves, what can we do? One is how we talk about it, saying older adults versus elderly or seniors. Not disparaging ourselves, you know. So I've done it myself. I've said, oh, I'm having a senior moment, I can't remember that. That just kind of reinforces the idea that if you're older you can't remember things, or your brain isn't working well. And so not doing that. Again, this advocacy, when we do that, if we're advocating for ourselves, for our parents, you avoiding using overwhelming terms like there's a silver tsunami or a gray wave coming. That makes it sound insurmountable. Rather saying, here's things that we need when we age that we should be looking for and advocating for. Just briefly, I want to mention, because I thought it was so interesting, on campus, the Institute of Aging has a fall conference every year, really geared for the public. They bring in researchers from campus, also have guest speakers who talk on aging, and it's, if you get a chance to go, it's a wonderful event. And I attended one year, and there was someone there who talked about ageism, and he said, you know, there's lots of isms, racism, sexism, where we other people, we say, you know, those other people aren't as good as us, you know, we're better. But he said ageism is the one ism where we're discriminating against our future selves. When we discriminate against older adults, put them down, don't meet their needs, don't include them, don't benefit from their experience, we're discriminating against the place that we're going to end up. So I think as we move through life, whatever stage you're in, we can realize that's going to be us someday, and the people that we love, and we should be advocating for them. I think the last point or two I have is on also being realistic about our expectations as we age. I think it's often lauded, you know, the 100-year-old that jumped out of a airplane and skydived and ran a marathon. And, you know, we know that's not going to be most of us. And so that has affected my work. On the left is a picture I used to use in my, well, I am still in this talk, but I used to use regularly in talks about seniors. And, you know, the woman has her leg all the way up above her head. You know, how realistic is that as we get older? I couldn't have done that when I was younger. I can't do it now. So I've been more careful in my own presentations to not put forth unrealistic expectations either. It's about aging gracefully, aging as healthy as we can. It's not about doing things that, you know, hardly anybody else can do. So now I use this picture on the right. Then putting it all together, which will leave us a little bit of time for questions. I just wanted to kind of go back to that first slide when we talked about all the things that are involved with healthy aging. And so, yes, in my area, I talk mostly about healthy eating and drinking and staying active. But there are many other things that we can do to help us age healthfully. And I just wanted to point out, I took a stab at putting the arrows in, but I think they could all, the bubbles could go to each other, about how they interact. So when we think about it, if we do know an older adult and maybe they're married, kids are gone or they don't have any, and their spouse dies, maybe they become more lonely, maybe they don't drive, so they stay home. They don't go to the senior center like they were, so they're not active. Maybe they can develop some depression, or then it gets hard. You know, I found it hard when my kids left to cook for just two people, you know, and then you're just cooking for one person. So maybe you don't cook as much, and then you're not eating well. So then you're tired and you stop, you know, doing your crossword, or getting out. So these things can kind of interact. And I think it's important as we get older that we look at our eating and our drinking and being active, but we also look at, are we being social? Are we engaging our minds like you all are today by getting online and listening to me talk away? Are we reaching out, maybe going to the senior center, going to our church? Um, are we making an effort to take advantage of all the healthcare opportunities that are offered to us, preventive care and that kind of thing? And if we can kind of keep those all up, I think we have a better chance at each one of those propping the other up and getting us to the healthiest place that we can be in our life as we get older. So I just wanted to end with a quote that came from one of those studies of people that were over 100, which was, the older you get, the healthier you've been. So the healthier we are, the more likely we are to get older and to get there without chronic disease or disability. If we begin to struggle with our health very early, it's really going to put up some barriers and things that we're going to have to get over as we get older. So I think you just have to take where you are now and look, where can I go moving forward to be healthy? Look at who's around you and who you can help, your parents or your children or grandchildren or your spouse or your friends. How can we come together to keep each other healthy so that as we get older, we've been healthy and therefore we can get to old age? And then the last thing I thought I'd share is pictures of myself with my mother. This is, I think, an example of resilience. She was about 85 or 6, I think, in the picture on the left. She said she'd come to a Badger football game with me. It was like sleeting sideways when we got there and wet. And I said, Mom, you don't have to go. She said, nope, I'm going to go. I want to see a Badger game. So she came to the Badger game with me. And I think that was just really an example of resilience. She could have sat home. And to make it up to her, though, on the right, I took her to a volleyball game. So we were inside, although it was pouring rain the day I took her. And again, she was up for whatever our family was doing. She had come to live with me after my dad died, and she just wanted to stay active, stay engaged, stay involved. And so now she's in assisted living. She's 92. She's got some decline, but I often tell her, Mom, if you hadn't done all that stuff, you wouldn't still be here with us. So I think it really paid off for her to have been so resilient and engaged in life. So with that, I think, Misty, we could open it up if anybody has questions. I know it was a lot of material to cover fast, and so we can try to answer any questions that you have.
Yep, there's already 7 questions in the Q&A, so if you want to open that up.
Okay. Let's see if I can find it here. Okay. So regarding the first question, is there a difference between table salt and sea salt? I would have to look into that a little more carefully. I don't think that there's enough to make a big difference. I would say we tend to eat with processed food a lot of sodium, and the most important thing is to look at substituting some whole foods for processed foods to cut down our sodium. After that, I think it's personal preference about which you want to use to salt your food or to cook with. Certainly, salt is kind of an acquired taste, and it is one we can learn to unacquire, if that's a word. Eating less of it over time, we tend to prefer it less. I know that's happened to me as I've gotten older and cut it out, that now I really sense it. And so I don't think there's a big difference nutritionally, but I think it would then just be personal preference. So somebody also asked, is 30 grams of protein a day or a meal, so closer to 90 grams a day? It is 30 grams a meal, maybe 20 to 30. This is one where I would, if you're thinking of adding protein to your diet, I would talk to your doctor first, because one does have to have good kidney function. If you do, a little more protein should be fine, but I would talk to your doctor. I would also recommend really looking at oatmeal and grains and legumes and other plant sources, as well as lean meats and dairy or soy. There can be a time for a protein supplement, but I'm not sure we all need it. And when you do that, you just get the protein. You don't get everything else that comes with something like a legume, which has so many other things in it. There may be a time where you can use that. I don't know it's worth spending a lot of money on protein supplements or on foods fortified with protein. I'd look more at whole foods. Um, if a product contains honey powder, how can the guaranteed analysis list no added sugar? Boy, I don't know about that. I would have to look um, at the product itself. So generally what the regulation was about is if the purpose of adding the sugar is it isn't intrinsic to the food composition, then you have to say that it has added sugar. So usually something like if you take some oh, there's fruit snacks for kids and they sweeten them with fruit juice. That fruit juice is considered added sugar. If you have, even cranberry juice, if you add apple juice to it to make it sweeter, that's considered added sugar. So generally, I wouldn't think honey powder would be allowed to say no added sugar, but I'm not, maybe it has to do with the composition of the food. If honey is something that's in the food. So for instance, let me think of honey itself isn't added sugar. Honey is honey. It's sugar is what's in it. So I would have to look at that product some more. Someone asked, what do you wish upon to better translate research into healthy, functional aging in the modern world? Okay, I'm not quite sure what you're asking about, but I think if we could have more support for healthy food access through our lives, healthy school lunches and breakfasts, more availability of small markets. I was just reading a bit about this in France, where they are a little bit more healthier than us. They have their problems too, about how there's been a lot of regulation to support and subsidizing to support local farmers and local markets and farmers markets, and having markets that people can walk to. They don't have to drive. You can imagine if you can't drive anymore and you're 5 miles from the grocery store, what are you going to do? You have to pay for an Uber, you have to take the bus. How much harder it is than if it was close by. So I think it would be having more healthy whole foods available to us throughout our lifespan, and encouraged by the way that they're provided versus, this is my own personal bugaboo, but I've mentioned this, the way that so many department stores have gone, where they have long twisty lines for you to get out, and it might be like a store selling sheets and towels and things like that, but yet in that long twisty line is chocolate and candy, making that so available to us as opposed to healthy foods. Someone said, if you don't take vitamins, what do you recommend? I would say if you are, I talk to your doctor to see if there's anything you need. My doctor made one particular recommendation to me. But after that, I think the whole foods again, as far as you can end up on the whole food end versus the processed food end, read the labels. So if you are going to eat a processed food like a cereal, compare two cereals, which one's higher in fiber, lower in sugar. And then I would say the plant foods. It's just, most of us eat enough, unless we're vegetarians, animal foods. We may not get enough dairy. That would be something to look at. But most of us eat some meat, brats, of course, burgers, big here in Wisconsin. But especially the things like legumes, nuts, seeds, beans, pulses, dried peas, lentils. They're just things, for instance, I didn't grow up on as much of that. I grew up, my mother was raised on a farm. We grew up with more with potatoes, but more of those kind of whole grains, whole foods would provide a lot of nutrients that we might not be getting. Someone asked good sources of protein, and someone else related said yogurt choices. So I would try for plain yogurt if you can get it without added sugar, and then put in your own fruit or nuts, or a little bit of sweetener if you want. Greek yogurt is nice. I think one thing you can do is look at some substitutions. So I've moved away from using sour cream to using yogurt. I make a chicken chili that would call for cream and for sour cream, and I use fat-free half and half and Greek yogurt, and I think it comes out pretty good. So I look more for plain yogurts, ones without added sugars. So things like yogurt, cottage cheese. Those are dairy choices high in protein. I would also again look at the plants, the legumes, the beans, the dried peas, and you can buy a lot of those things fresh, but you can also get them packaged, of course, and canned. So I think one of the things not to forget is, canned beans. I try to get them without salt or with reduced sodium. You can rinse them to get some of the sodium off. Um, but canned things, and I would just throw in, even though it's not protein, fruits and vegetables. I keep a couple of big packages of frozen vegetables in our freezer. So if for some reason we didn't get to the store and we don't have good fresh vegetables, we can get out the frozen. They're frozen in the field, plenty of nutrients in them. So I would say also as we get older, one of the things to look at is how do we stock our pantry with sources of protein? How do we stock our freezer? So when we can't get out, or we don't have time, or we're tired, or we don't want to cook for just one, we have healthy alternatives that we can just, open the can or open the frozen package and get some good foods. How someone asked how they can be a better um, advocate for older adults committee in a community that favors younger groups. I would say take a look at UW Extension and see if they have a workshop. This isn't as much my area. A lot of my colleagues work in it, so I hear from them. But I think advocating for us as the things that are going to help all of us are going to help older adults, and they're going to help the younger people. So then as they age, they also do well. So the things like safe trails and accessible food and safe places. I mean, safe places are good for older adults to walk, but they're also good for children to play, or for older adults to take their children or their grandchildren to play. So I think advocating for, we're doing this for all of us as we age. We might be aging from toddler to preschooler to middle schooler on up, or we might be aging from young adult to middle age to older adult. So it's benefiting all of us. That would be my general suggestion. They would have more to say about that. Someone asked, are protein bars okay for increasing protein? Certainly that's a good option. I think it's especially good if you're on the run. I'm a cyclist. Sometimes I'm kind of on the run for cycling and I know I need some protein afterwards, but I'm, headed off to the store. And so a protein bar might be good. Read the ingredient listing, make sure it doesn't have a lot of other ingredients you don't want. But then I would say, if you have time to sit down to a meal, that's when we want to look at whole foods. Someone asked if we need supplemental iodine. To be honest, I would have to look at that. It varies by area. I can say my mother, who was in the pictures, had a goiter because she did not have enough iodine in northern Wisconsin growing up. I think now we have it in salt, and so generally we don't need to take it ourselves. If you're worried about that, ask your doctor, because I can't, I'm not quite sure about iodine is something we get out of, the environment in our foods, and I'm not sure how we are here right now, but I think most people are okay. I would ask your doctor if you're worried about that. Someone asked, is maple syrup or honey a good sub for white sugar in baking? That is one I think is a taste preference. I am a firm believer sugar is sugar. Natural versus added, they're still sugar. They're still simple sugars. Y'all have probably heard the kind of fuss around, trying to get rid of artificial sweeteners and high fructose corn syrup. And so Coke was going to came out with a soda that has cane sugar in it. It's still sugar, same amount of calories, still metabolized the same way. So I think in terms of baking, I would use what works best for your baking and not worry so much about what kind it is. It's going to be pretty much metabolized and addressed in your body in the same way. Whole foods that work for someone with diabetes. I'm not a registered dietitian, so I'm not one to give advice for people who have disease. I work more in the prevention area. I would say mixed meals with high in fiber help to modulate anybody's blood glucose and would be a good way to work. So not refined grains, but the most whole grains that you can find that are higher in dietary fiber. Again, someone asked about protein powders like whey protein. Again, I think if you need to up your protein for a specific reason, I've put whey protein powder in a smoothie when I'm going to cycle on the weekend and we're going to be out for 40 or 50 miles. Um, it's an easier way for me to get in it. It isn't the way that I eat when I'm eating meals. If I'm sitting down to a meal, then I get proteins um, from mixed foods. Um, Somebody asked, how do we engage others in being active and healthy when they're not motivated? That's a tough one. I think being a role model is good. Um, Maybe just talking about how you feel, not being judgmental, of course. Um, Asking people to accompany you. I'm going to walk around the block with the dog. Would you like to come along? Fixing healthy meals for them. Um, Offering to go with them maybe to the grocery store to help them or help them cook. Um, I just think doing it in community is better than preaching. I know, my kids grew up with me telling them all about nutrition, and one went to the introductory nutrition course here at UC Davis or UW Madison and came home and told me, did you know this about nutrition? I've been saying it their whole life, but there was a professor saying it. That wasn't their mother. So sometimes, having it come from other people is more healthy or helpful. Sharing, I was on this webinar and they were talking about whole foods and this is what they said, should we give that a try? So I think trying to do it in community and might be better than, I don't want to say nagging because I don't like to nag and I don't think anybody else does, but sharing versus telling. Someone said, I know this is about nutrition. Can you ask about a mindset for keeping people healthy? There's a big mindfulness center here on campus. I think Monona Terrace does meditation. I believe Misty said on Thursdays that might be online. Yoga. I think whatever you believe in. So if you believe in something spiritually, practicing that, if you believe in prayer, if you believe in a religion or a church, often I think community. I was so struck on Meals on Wheels. We did it actually during COVID, my son and I, over lunch, how much people were hungering for company, how much during COVID they hurt for that. And they would, we couldn't get near them, but they would thank us for coming and they would call out and they'd tell us something about their dog. And I think helping others and then having them help us by being in community can go a long way to helping us feel better and to help with aging. Someone asked about foods to keep heart healthy. I think high fiber foods, whole grain foods, being careful about, and someone else is asking about yogurt, fat free or low fat. Being careful about how much fat, how much saturated fat. There is some work suggesting that dairy fat may not be as the same as meat fat, for instance, and so low fat maybe, if that's what you prefer, maybe just as acceptable as a fat-free yogurt. I know I make choices in terms of what foods I do and do like fat-free and which I don't. Fat-free yogurt tastes fine to me. I have used a low fat or a fat free ice cream and I thought it was horrible. I just think, okay, I'm just going to limit my ice cream intake. I'm not going to make it fat free or low fat. And, that is true for other foods. Some people just don't care for fat free something. I don't think everything has to be fat free, kind of how we went a while back with salad dressings and everything. I think low fat could be just fine. I'll do one more because I think we're almost at time. Organic or non-organic. I think if you can afford organic, that's great. However, the most important thing is to eat a lot of fruits and vegetables and whole grains. So whether they're organic or not, eating more of them is probably our answer versus focusing as much on organic and non-organic.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Olson, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. Please fill out the survey that will be emailed to you later today and give us your feedback. Your feedback is important to us and will help direct our programming. A reminder, a copy of this webinar and list of links will be posted on the Wellness Talks page of the Monona Terrace website. Also see chat. I've also put the link in the chat. Until next time, goodbye, everyone. Have a great day.